Let's talk about something huge today. Have you ever wondered if a country becoming more diverse changes how people feel about things like universal health care or social security? Well, we're diving into a fascinating piece of research that suggests the answer is, well, it's a lot more complicated than you might think.
So, the researcher behind this study actually started with a personal puzzle. They noticed that Polish immigrants they knew, folks who were all in on the welfare state back in Poland, came to the US and became, well, super skeptical of the exact same kinds of programs. How does that happen? What causes that kind of complete 180? I mean, it's not like their fundamental values or their work ethic suddenly changed on the flight over. Nope. The country around them changed. And that right there is the central mystery we're going to unpack. The author actually has a name for this, the Chicago paradox. Think about it. Back in Poland, a society that's pretty homogeneous, pretty equal, welfare is just seen as a common good, something everyone pitches in for. But you drop them into the diverse, unequal landscape of Chicago, and their whole perspective just flips. Supporters become skeptics. And here's where it gets really interesting. When asked why they changed their minds, they'd say that American welfare wasn't for people like them, hardworking immigrants. They saw it as a system that mainly served other minority groups. And the author notes they were specifically talking about Black communities. It's this shift to an us versus them mentality that's the absolute key to this whole puzzle. So this one personal story kind of cracks open a much bigger question, and it's really the heart of this research. Why does diversity sometimes seem to go hand in hand with less generosity? The theory isn't that people just suddenly stop caring. It's way more nuanced than that. Okay, so here's a crucial term you gotta get: interethnic inequality. This isn't just about a country having different ethnic groups living together. It's specifically about when there are big economic gaps between those groups, when one group, on average, is way wealthier than another. That economic piece of it, that's the secret sauce here. And this slide just lays it out perfectly. In a homogenous society, people tend to see welfare as, pooling money and sharing it within the community. It's our group helping our group. But when you add in that high level of interethnic inequality, the whole perception can change. Welfare starts to feel less like sharing and more like a transfer of resources from our group to their group. So the research points to a few specific things that start to, well, chip away at that social solidarity. You've got simple things like communication barriers or different ideas about how public money should be spent. Then there's the fact that, we all have a natural tendency to want to help people who are like us. And of course, there's that big one we just saw, that powerful perception that welfare is just taking money from us and giving it to them. Okay, so that's the theory, but is there any hard evidence for it? Does it hold up in the real world? Let's take a look at the data, and we're going to start with some studies from all across Europe. Get this, a study in Spain found something pretty remarkable. In towns where immigration went up significantly over an 8-year period, the slice of the budget dedicated to welfare was cut on average by a staggering 26%. As the towns got more diverse, public support for social spending just plummeted. And what's really fascinating is where that money went instead. The study found that while the welfare share of the budget was going down, the share going to police spending was actually going up. So it wasn't like the towns were broke. Their priorities just shifted. And it's not just a one-off thing in Spain. Over in Sweden, researchers found a really direct link. For every 1% increase in a town's refugee population, public support for welfare dropped by almost a full point on a 10-point scale. And here's the kicker. Because the government decided where refugees were settled, this wasn't just a correlation. It strongly suggests a direct causal link. Now, this is interesting. A huge study across Europe found that not all diversity seems to have the same effect. The presence of immigrants from Middle Eastern and North African countries had a negative impact on welfare support that was 3 times stronger than the effect from other immigrant groups. It really suggests that how culturally distant groups feel from one another plays a big role. All right, now let's hop across the Atlantic and look at the American picture, because the research here adds a really critical twist. It turns out the story isn't just about diversity, it's about economic division. So what about the US? You think it's the same story, right? But when researchers dug into the data on state-level spending, they found something that might surprise you. Ethno-racial diversity all by itself was not the main driver of lower welfare support. There was something else going on, something much more powerful. And that something was interethnic inequality. Remember that term? It was the size of the economic gap between racial groups that was the strongest predictor of how much a state was willing to spend on its social safety net. That was the real game changer.
This slide just nails the point home. After the big welfare reform in 1994, states that were diverse but had pretty small income gaps between racial groups spent about the same on welfare as homogeneous states did. But in the states where you had high diversity and big economic inequality between groups, that's where welfare spending was way, way lower. It seems like the combination of those two things is the really toxic mix.
So, what's the big takeaway from all of this? The author pulls all these threads together to ask a really important question about the future, and it's aimed squarely at Europe. You have to remember, Europe's famous, generous welfare states were mostly built at a time when those countries were, by and large, ethnically homogenous. The whole system was kind of built on this foundation of a strong shared identity, that feeling of, hey, we're all in this together. And this is what leads the author to a really powerful hypothesis for the future. It basically goes like this. As Europe becomes more diverse, and if economic gaps start to grow between new immigrant groups and the native population, will Europe start to see the exact same pressures on its welfare state that the US has been dealing with for decades? The research suggests Europe might be walking down a very similar path. Which leaves us with a massive critical question for our time. As our societies all over the world become more diverse, what is the glue that's going to hold our social safety nets together? If it's not a shared ethnic background anymore, what is it? And this research points to a pretty clear answer. Tackling the economic inequality between groups might just be the single most important challenge for the future of the welfare state.